manners of articulation. First, let's think about the fact that English has 24 consonant phonemes and 14 vowel phonemes. We will discuss what phonemes are later, but for now, just think about 24 consonants and 14 vowels. Now, this is quite a number of consonants and vowels, but they have to combine in such a way as to create the many, many words of English, and to make sure that these words are different enough in form and meaning so that, the language can function as it's supposed to. Now let's refer to speech. And then the question is, how do we create these 38 different phonemes? There must be several processes involved, and indeed there are. So the first process we're going to discuss today in detail is manner of articulation. We will later on go into more detail about voicing in place of articulation, which are the other major processes. And indeed, these three processes together we use to define, name each consonant. There are also a few minor processes such as length and stress, which we will again look at later. Speech. Speech is basically an overlay onto something that we do all the time. We breathe. We breathe in and out in order to live. The body needs oxygen, which it absorbs from the air in the lungs in order to break down food and create energy. This used up air is then pushed out of the lungs and we take in new air. Well, in a very clever way, the brain uses this air coming out of the lung to create speech. It manipulates that speech in various ways. It manipulates that air in various ways in order to create speech. Let's look at the chart of all of the consonants. Now, this is a lot of detail, but what we're going to do is take pieces of it and go through each piece. But I just wanted you to see the overall chart that we're going to be discussing and working on. And you'll notice over here, we have manner of articulation, and that's where we're starting. So the first thing we want to consider is the airflow. What are we going to do to it? And manner really refers to the manner in which we manipulate the air. So the first possibility is to completely stop the exiting air and create a sound. And we do this in English by creating three different places of articulation where we stop the air. And that's at the lips, at the alveolar ridge, and back at the velum. Now, each of these three places has a pair of sounds which only differ in voicing. And we'll get to that, the voicing we'll get to later. Nasals use the same place of articulation, but they're all voiced. And this voiced air for nasals flows through the nose. Now, that was the overview. Let's now talk about stops and nasals in more detail. The three places of articulation, as I said, bilabial, alveolar, and velar. The nasals are produced in the same place, bilabial, alveolar, and velar. But notice that there's a difference between a stop and a nasal. And that difference is that a nasal is a stop. But instead of completely stopping the air, as we do with p, t, k, or pot, tot, and cot, when we do a nasal, we stop the air in the mouth, but we let the air go through the nose, creating a n sound, which is added to the stop articulation. So that's why nasals have the name nasals, because the air flows through the nose. The voicing pattern is P and B, T and D, K and G. Those are the pairs. And nasals are M, N, and Ng. so that we now have the stops all together here. And again, what are they? You stop the air completely, except in the case of nasals, where the air then flows through the nose, and as well as the stop. All right. Now, the third action or manner that we're going to talk about is fricatives. We still have the air coming out from the lungs, and we stopped it in the first category. This time, we're not going to stop the air. We're going to squeeze the air. We're going to squeeze it down so narrowly that there's actually friction or noise that's created, hence the name fricative. And this noise can easily be heard when one is producing this sound in language. So sh, zh, s, z. So you see what happens is I'm squeezing in the mouth, I'm squeezing the air to the point where this noise is produced. And we have 5 places where the air is squeezed in the case of fricatives. And all of these fricatives, except H, occur as both voiced and voiceless. So we have pairs again. The pairs are here. F and V, fan and van, thy and thigh, thigh, which is a funny kind of minimal pair that we use to hear those 2 sounds in English. But we'll come back to that in a little more detail later. S and Z, sink and zinc, shoe and jus and H. Okay, so 5 places and pairs where they're voiced and voiceless except for H. Another possibility, so we've now done stops, we've done fricatives. English does another clever thing. It says, why not combine a stop and a fricative? Oh, and then we produce another sound. And in this case, we're going to put a t with a sh and a d with a j and create 2 new phonemes. You might say, well, wait a minute, 2 new phonemes? Well, we combine the stop and fricative in such a way that native speakers, when we hear them, they think it's only one sound. So in terms of representing it in an alphabet, you only need 1 symbol for ch and j. And but the phonetic reality is that there are actually 2 sounds which have come together to form a new and more perfect union. All right. The final choice deals with approximants. So we started at the top of the mouth with stops, where the air was completely stopped. Then we dropped down to fricatives, where the air was squeezed significantly. Then we found that you could combine a stop and a fricative for affricates. The most complicated of all these consonants are the approximants. Approximants, as the name kind of indicates, are approximately in the middle of the mouth. They're the highest consonant just above the vowels. And as we will see later, vowels take up most of the mouth and consonants take up a little bit of the mouth, the top part of the mouth. So consonants are reduced to that channel along the top of the mouth, but the approximants are at the bottom of that channel, if you will, above the vowels. They're all voiced and they all have complicated articulations. So let's do the first one, which is W. And this is a complicated sound because it has 2 articulations, 2 places of articulation. Bilabial and velar. So you produce the W with a definite rounding of the lips for the bilabial, and then you use the tongue at the back of the mouth, producing a velar to produce the second part of that articulation. So you'll notice all the other articulations we've been talking about were single places of articulation. So notice W has 2. Now the next one is the L. We call it a lateral approximant. So again, something complicated. With an L, you put your tongue at the alveolar ridge and produce a sound by lowering the side of the tongue. And so hence lateral side. And that means that the sound that comes out is sort of like a vowel, but it's high enough to be this consonant. And then we move to the palatal approximant, which is y, if you will, as in you and yes. And this is the tongue moves up to the palatal region, and there's some movement there, some gliding, and it produces this sound that's a consonant, but still sounds pretty vowel-like, as you can hear by just saying it. The last approximant is the R, the alveolar approximant. And I have a special section to deal with R simply because it's the most complicated sound in English. Okay, we named it as an alveolar approximant. So it's approximately at the alveolar area. You know, when I say it's the most difficult, it's even the most difficult for native speakers. Children often learn it at last when they're producing or learning the consonants of English. And so if native speakers learn it last, you can imagine that non-native speakers also say it's pretty difficult to learn. Why? Well, most of the languages in the world will use a tap or a trill. Now, let me explain what a tap is. A tap is the tongue goes up quickly, hits the alveolar ridge, and drops back down. That's so tap the tongue at the top of the mouth onto the alveolar ridge. It's technically not a stop, it's sort of a half a stop, if you will, just enough interruption of the air to be heard, but very rapid. And then many languages also take this tap and repeat it, and that repetition forms a trill. So ara, 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 ara. And these are very common R's in the languages of the world. But English does not use either one of these as a phoneme, as a major sound. Now, English does have the tap, but it's an allophone of T and D. We'll get to that later on. So because it's so different from what happens in most other languages, that's the first level of confusion. How is it articulated? Well, you take a central position in the mouth with the tongue tip roughly at the alveolar ridge. This position is not as relaxed as but it is high enough to be on the border between a consonant and a vowel. Remember, the vowels are in the bottom part of the mouth. The consonants are in the top part of the mouth. So an R is right at the top of the vowel area and at the bottom of the consonant area. And have you noticed that I've actually defined the difference between a consonant and a vowel? You probably have heard this term and used it for many, many years, but I don't know that anyone ever explained it. But essentially, vowels have an open mouth articulation and consonants have a very closed mouth articulation. So that's the difference between a consonant and a vowel. Now, how does R perform? Well, when it's before a vowel, and it's very important to notice before a vowel and after a vowel. Before a vowel, it sounds like and at the beginning of a word, it's very strong. It has lip rounding added to it. So right. And if you can see my mouth tighten up, that's the lip rounding on R at the beginning of a word, making it more intelligible, more hearable. And notice that native speaker children, when they're learning English, often say wabbit for rabbit. And you might, well, what is this? You know, why are they calling a rabbit wabbit? It's because they notice the lip rounding on rabbit, and because R is so difficult, they substitute the W, the lip rounding, for the R. And these are native speaker children. Now that was before a vowel. Consonant, strong lip rounding when it's before a vowel at the beginning of a word. Now let's switch to after a vowel. Whoa, things really change. If the vowel is a kind of a neutral vowel, schwa, the R just absolutely merges with it. We'll get to this later on when we work more on vowels. But if it's after a vowel, it also will color the vowel, so to speak, or overlap with the vowel. And so basically, when the ER at the beginning, at the end of a word in English, butter, letter, it's very hard to hear the difference between the vowel and the R. As a matter of fact, you basically could say it's a vowel and an R, and it really doesn't matter too much what the vowel is. And we'll explain why that's a fact about English later on. But notice that this difference between R before vowels and after vowels is one of the major differences in the dialects of English. Some British dialects significantly reduce the R after vowels, and even more when the vowel has an R after it at the end of a word. In this case, for me, it's barely perceptible. Why? Because the dominant English in America has a strong R before vowels, but an R is still there after vowels. And this difference has been called R-less versus R-ful. So I speak an R-ful dialect. Prestige dialects in English versus the United States differ in the degree of R-fulness. Received pronunciation, or RP, is the prestige dialect in England, and it is pretty much R-less. The upper classes there are the best example of those who speak this dialect. And in the early days of the formation of America, the early immigrants who came from the upper classes were tended towards this British prestige usage of R-lessness. And remnants of this practice can still be heard today in the dialects of New York and Boston, the ports in the early days of America. But since most of the immigrants from the British Isles were, farmers and laborers and workers, and their dialect tended to be R-ful, and that has become the prestige usage in America. So remember, R before a vowel, R after a vowel. R after a vowel, major difference between the dialects of British and American English. We've now reached the end of Unit 1. But before we leave totally, I would like to go back to that chart and review what we did today. Mainly, we talked about manner of articulation. Plosive or stop, that's when the air is completely stopped. Affricate, that's when we add a stop and a fricative together. Over here, those are the two symbols. Fricative, remember the fricatives. Nasal, that's a stop plus letting the air flow through the nose. The approximants, W, it's in two places, labiovelar. Lateral, the L, alveolar, but with the side of the tongue lowered. The R is in approximately the palato-alveolar, the alveolar region in the middle of the mouth. The Y is the palatal that we talked about. And something we haven't talked about at all much is the glottal H. When we do the vowels, we're going to talk about the glottis and the articulation of vowels. Just notice that H is kind of a strange consonant. It's down here in the bottom of the throat, and we'll get back to it. So I've had to mention some of these other terms as we talked about this because it's hard to cut something up into small pieces, but we focused mainly on the manners of articulation. And next we will move to voicing and place of articulation. That will be Unit 2 and Unit 3. Okay for now. Bye.